In the waning months of World War II, the southern regions of Okinawa became a no-man's land of shifting front lines, abandoned villages, and forgotten civilians. Nestled between jagged ridgelines and dense brush was a nameless valley, marked only by its silence. It was here that over 200 Japanese women, young girls, and elderly survivors took shelter after their homes were consumed by shellfire. They had been herded into nearby caves by retreating Imperial soldiers, told it was the only place they might be safe. But safety had long ceased to mean anything. The air in the valley was thick with soot and stillness. Explosions echoed off the rock faces during the day, while the nights were pierced only by the faint murmur of prayer or the stifled sobs of mothers who no longer had the strength to cry aloud. There were no fires, no lanterns, no cooking. Every sound risked detection. The women huddled in pitch darkness, clutching one another not out of comfort, but out of fear that they would vanish alone. Many had fled with nothing. A few still carried bloodied remnants of their past lives in torn kimonos and broken sandals. Propaganda had done its job well. Most of the women in the valley believed surrender was worse than death. Stories had spread for years through radio broadcasts and schoolrooms. Stories of Americans who dismembered prisoners, raped girls, and burned villages for sport. Even as bombs fell from American planes, the greater terror was what might happen if the soldiers ever arrived in person. The caves were not sanctuaries. They were tombs waiting to be sealed. Among the women were teenagers barely old enough to understand war, and grandmothers who had already buried husbands and sons. Many sat in silence for hours at a time, watching shadows dance across the rocks and imagining they were ghosts. A few still carried knives beneath their sleeves, given to them by officers with stern faces and trembling hands. They had been told to use them on themselves and on their children if the enemy came too close. Days passed without word, then weeks. The valley, once a place of desperation, became a place of resignation. No one spoke of rescue. No one expected salvation. Their world had narrowed to the cold stone beneath their feet and the oppressive air inside the caverns. Even the sound of gunfire had become background noise, distant thunder that promised nothing. And then, without warning, the front shifted. The gunfire came closer. The ground began to tremble again beneath artillery fire, this time on the nearby ridges. The women could hear movement through the trees, boots, shouted orders, the distant grind of tank treads. Something had changed. The war had returned to the valley. But no one moved. They waited, as they had always waited, for death or for whatever came next. What they didn't know, what they couldn't have imagined, was that someone was already watching them from the ridgeline. A single soldier, an American, not with rage in his heart or fire in his hands, but with confusion in his eyes. He had seen the movement, he had heard the cries, and now, standing alone in the brush, Sergeant Robert Carter was beginning to understand that the enemy hidden in this valley were not soldiers at all, but something far more fragile and far more human. At sunrise on May 17th, Sergeant Robert Carter stood on the edge of a narrow ravine, his boots pressed into damp earth and his eyes scanning the quiet valley below. The order had come in minutes earlier. His platoon was to pull back immediately to a secondary defensive line. The front had collapsed further south, and any unit remaining risked being cut off or encircled. Carter relayed the command over the radio, watching as his men gathered their gear, already weary from days of shelling. He should have turned and followed them. Instead, something stopped him. The sound was faint, almost mistaken for the wind. A cluster of muffled voices, not in English, and not the sharp bark of military orders. Carter tilted his head, listening closer. It was crying. Not the wounded moan of soldiers, but the soft, broken sobbing of women. He moved carefully toward a thicket near the edge of a rock face. Through the green, between shadows and dust, he saw them. Dozens of eyes staring back, frightened, sunken, and hollow. The moment lasted only seconds, but it altered everything. The women were crammed into shallow caves and narrow crevices, barely visible beneath layers of soot and camouflage. Some clutched bundles that might have been children. Others held their own arms as if trying to disappear inside themselves. They didn't move. They didn't scream. They simply watched, too exhausted to flee, too frightened to hope. Carter didn't need a translator to understand the fear in their eyes. He raised his hands slowly, trying to appear non-threatening. He had seen enough villages, enough civilian casualties to recognize who these people were. They weren't soldiers. They weren't saboteurs. They were refugees, abandoned and forgotten in the chaos of shifting front lines. The caves were their last defense, not against artillery, but against the stories they had been told, stories about men like him. Carter's training told him to report the situation and move out. The evac point was less than 2 miles away. He knew there would be no reinforcements, no time to coordinate a rescue. But his conscience wouldn't allow him to leave. He reached for his radio and reported what he saw. Civilians in the valley, estimated 200, mostly women. He requested immediate evacuation support. The reply came back quickly and without hesitation. Denied. Pull out. Too dangerous. No assets available. He stood there in silence, gripping the handset. His orders were clear, but so was the situation in front of him. If he left now, these people would be exposed to whoever reached the valley next, be it Japanese stragglers, rogue militia, or more likely, the impersonal chaos of crossfire. He looked back down into the ravine. A young girl was staring at him, her face streaked with soot, her hands trembling over the edge of a rock. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Carter switched off the radio and dropped it into the dirt. He pointed to the ridge behind him, the direction of the American lines. Then he pointed to the women, motioning with broad, urgent gestures to follow. At first, no one moved. Fear anchored them in place. But one woman stood, then another, and slowly, hesitantly, they began to gather their things, shawls, torn shoes, scraps of cloth. He motioned again. The path was narrow. They would have to go single file. He would cover them. It didn't matter that he had no backup, no orders, no guarantee of survival. What mattered was that there was still a choice to make. And Robert Carter made it. He turned his body toward the valley's mouth and prepared to hold the line alone, even if it cost him everything. The exit from the valley was a narrow incline carved between 2 rocky slopes, no wider than a single truck, and fully exposed to the surrounding high ground. Sergeant Carter had studied it briefly before. During training exercises, they called these zones kill funnels. It was the only way out, but it was also a perfect trap. He positioned himself halfway up the slope where he had a view of the terrain. His rifle rested across a flat stone, and his eyes locked on the tree line opposite. He told the women to move quickly but carefully, one at a time, and he gestured where to stay low. The first few groups passed through the gap without incident. Elderly women supporting each other, young girls carrying small bundles wrapped in cloth, 1 or 2 limping badly. Carter watched every step, scanning the ridges for movement. Then, without warning, gunfire erupted. The sharp crack of a Japanese Arisaka rifle echoed from the ridgeline, followed by a burst from a Type 99 light machine gun. Dirt kicked up around the fleeing women, and one fell screaming, struck in the leg. Panic rippled through the crowd. Carter fired without hesitation. A single shot cracked from his rifle, and the first sniper went down, rolling behind the tree line. He shifted aim, found the source of the automatic fire, and loosed another volley. His training took over. Breathe, squeeze, relocate. Each shot was deliberate. He wasn't shooting to kill, he was shooting to protect, to stall, to buy seconds for every fragile life moving through the pass below. The fear in his chest had hardened into purpose. But he didn't fall back. He changed position again, crawling across gravel and scorched roots, leaving a faint smear of blood behind. He had been grazed across the thigh, but didn't notice until later. He threw a grenade into a thicket where muzzle flashes had sparked. The explosion was followed by a scream, and then silence. The women kept moving. Some ran, others crawled, but they moved. His position was soon marked by the enemy. 2 soldiers attempted to flank him from the eastern slope, appearing briefly between the trees. Carter dropped one with a clean shot to the torso and wounded the other, who tumbled backward out of sight. He knew they would regroup and come again, maybe in greater numbers, maybe with grenades of their own. But if he could hold the ridge for just 20 more minutes, the last wave of women might clear the pass. His body began to shake from exhaustion. Sweat and blood mixed under his uniform. His hands slipped on the rifle. Still, he stayed upright, heart pounding like a drum in his ears. One woman was helping another carry a wounded child. Carter waved them on, covering them with short, controlled bursts. Every time he saw a muzzle flash, he answered it. Every time someone stumbled, he called out, not with words, but with his rifle. Then came the moment he knew was inevitable. A sudden, sharp impact struck his upper back. The force of it sent him forward into the dirt. He gasped, stunned, trying to lift his arm, but unable to feel his shoulder. He had been hit. The world dimmed for a second, narrowed to pain and dust. But through the haze, he saw one last group of women at the edge of the rocks, huddled together, waiting for a sign. He lifted his head, raised one hand, and waved them through. As the final group began to move, Carter collapsed fully behind the rock. He could hear shouting, distant, unfamiliar. American voices. Reinforcements? Medics? He didn't know. But the gunfire was fading. The pass was nearly empty. And despite the blood soaking through his gear, he allowed himself the smallest exhale of relief. They had made it. Somehow, against every rule and every expectation, they had made it. When the gunfire finally faded and the last group of women disappeared over the ridge, the silence that followed was heavier than the explosions that had come before it. The valley, so recently filled with terror and movement, now seemed eerily still. A fine layer of smoke and dust hung in the air like a curtain, dimming the light and muffling sound. Birds, frightened by the chaos, had vanished. The only visible sign of life was the blood-soaked figure slumped behind a jagged stone, the lone American sergeant who had not retreated. Robert Carter lay motionless, his uniform torn, his helmet missing, one arm outstretched as though reaching for something he could no longer hold. His breathing was shallow, uneven, and every few minutes his body convulsed from pain. The wound in his back was serious, but it was the exhaustion that nearly killed him. He had given everything, every bullet, every breath, every ounce of strength to hold that line. And now that it was over, his body had nothing left to offer. From the safety of the rocks above, several of the Japanese women paused, turning back to look at the man who had covered their escape. They had seen him stand against gunfire, had watched him fire alone, wounded, refusing to fall until the last of them had passed. They had seen soldiers before, cold, mechanical, ruthless. But this was different. This man had not come to destroy. He had come to protect. One woman, older than the others, with gray hair tied back in a scarf, stepped away from the group. Slowly, cautiously, she made her way down the slope toward the wounded soldier. Her hands were raised in a sign of peace, though her fingers trembled. She had nothing to offer, no medicine, no English words. But she approached him not as an enemy, but as a human being reaching for another. When she reached him, Carter stirred slightly. His eyes fluttered open, unfocused, blood matting the side of his face. For a moment, they stared at each other. Two strangers from opposite sides of a brutal war, now joined in a silence deeper than language. The woman knelt beside him and pulled a cloth from around her shoulders. Gently, she placed it over his chest, a traditional gesture of respect for a warrior. Not a soldier of her army, not a man of her people, but a warrior all the same. Minutes later, the first American medics arrived. A patrol unit had picked up fragments of Carter's transmission and tracked the gunfire to the edge of the valley. They expected to find casualties, maybe civilians. What they did not expect was the quiet line of women standing above the ridge, watching without fear. Nor did they expect to find one of their own, still alive, barely conscious, with a Japanese woman kneeling beside him. The medics moved quickly, assessing Carter's injuries, stabilizing his wounds, and preparing him for transport. The older woman did not resist when they approached. She simply backed away slowly, bowing her head. One of the medics looked up at the group of women and gave a small, uncertain wave. To his surprise, several of them nodded. The tension that had defined every American-Japanese encounter on this island began to dissolve, not through negotiation or command, but through the power of what they had all just seen. Back at the forward aid station, Carter remained unconscious for hours. Word spread fast among the troops. A sergeant who had stayed behind to protect civilians, who had taken on enemy fire alone, and who had survived. Soldiers who had never met him now spoke his name with quiet respect. They didn't call him a hero. They called him the one who stayed. And in the valley he had defended, those who had watched him fight would never forget the image of the enemy who bled for them. In that moment, something fundamental shifted in their hearts. The American was no longer a faceless monster. He had become something far more powerful. A man willing to give his life for people he didn't know and wasn't supposed to care about. In the days following the firefight, the valley returned to quiet. But it was not the same silence as before. It was no longer the silence of fear or waiting. It was the silence of something sacred having passed through. The women who had once hidden in shadows now stepped into the open, gathering near the mouth of the valley where it had all happened. They did not know what to say, only that something in them had changed. American engineers arrived shortly after the evacuation to assess the terrain. They were focused on logistics, clearing trails, mapping safe routes, building a makeshift aid station for civilians. But when they passed through the narrow exit where Sergeant Carter had held the line, they stopped. The earth was still scorched, spent shell casings scattered across the rocks. In the center of it all was a blackened piece of stone where Carter had made his final stand. No one touched it. Without any formal order, one of the soldiers placed a small wooden board in the ground, carving into it with the tip of his knife. It read simply, "He stayed." No rank, no unit, no mention of the battle. Just those two words. Others came by and added their own marks, initials, scratched prayers, crude etchings of flags and crosses. It became an impromptu shrine. Back at the field hospital, Sergeant Carter was recovering slowly. He remained in and out of consciousness for several days, sedated and stitched up, his wounds serious but not fatal. When he finally opened his eyes fully and was able to speak, the first thing he asked was whether the women had made it. A nurse nodded. "All of them," she said. He closed his eyes again and wept. Word of what he had done spread beyond his unit. Other regiments heard the story, embellished in places, but always with the same core. One man had stayed behind, without orders, and made it possible for 200 civilians to escape. Officers debated whether to commend him or reprimand him for abandoning the withdrawal protocol. In the end, they chose silence. The truth was too powerful to file under regulation. Among the women he had saved, his name began to circulate. Spoken quietly, reverently, passed from mother to daughter, like a memory too fragile to be written down. None of them had known who he was during the chaos. He had no translator, no introduction. But they remembered his face, his posture, his defiance against bullets. For them, he became a figure not of war, but of mercy. A few days later, the older woman who had covered him with her shawl returned to the site. She brought with her a bundle wrapped in cloth, rice, dried fruit, a folded note in Japanese. She left it at the base of the wooden board. She didn't expect anyone to understand the note. It simply said, "Thank you for showing us what kind looks like." Then she walked away without a word. The army eventually moved on, advancing further inland. The valley was no longer of strategic value. The board was never officially removed, but weather began to wear it down. Months passed. The war ended. Soldiers went home. Many forgot the names of hills and coordinates and villages they once bled for. But for a small community of women in southern Okinawa, that nameless spot remained sacred ground. Years later, when a group of veterans returned to visit the island, one of them brought a stone marker to replace the decayed wooden board. It was simple, just a rectangular slab with an inscription in English and Japanese. He stayed, May 17, 1945, for the ones who had no weapons. It wasn't listed on any tourist map, nor did it appear in any military archive. But the people who knew, knew. Some of the women visited annually, bringing their grandchildren to the site. They would sit in silence, light incense, and tell the story in hushed voices. Not of the war, but of that day, of the gunfire, of the man who waved them forward while bleeding into the dirt. They did not speak of enemies or nations. They spoke only of a man who chose to stay behind when he could have left. For them, that decision rewrote everything they had been taught. It unraveled years of fear and dehumanization. It proved that mercy could survive war, even when buried under orders and uniforms and blood. The man's name might one day fade, but the choice he made had already taken root in their memory. And memory, when passed between generations, becomes a monument no bomb can destroy. Years passed, and the war that once scarred the island of Okinawa became the subject of textbooks and grainy black and white footage. Entire villages were rebuilt from ashes, families stitched together new lives, and the once ravaged valleys slowly returned to green. But in one quiet corner of the island, beneath a sloping hillside rarely marked on maps, the memory of a single act of defiance endured. Not through stone, not through ceremony, but through story, passed in low voices from those who had seen it to those who needed to understand it. Children born long after the war grew up hearing the tale of the soldier who did not leave. They knew the spot where he had stood, the angle of the rocks, the tree line from which the bullets had come. Their parents described it not with bitterness, but with awe. It was not a story of violence, it was a story of choice, and that made it sacred. Riku, one of the youngest boys who had been carried through the pass that day, grew into a quiet and thoughtful man. He never spoke much about the war, but each year on May 17 he would disappear into the hills with a small bag of incense and a folded American flag given to him by a veteran. He would place them by the stone marker and sit there for hours, saying nothing. Some assumed it was an act of grief. Others understood it was an act of gratitude. The stone itself weathered gently over time, moss gathering along its edges, the carved letters softening but never vanishing. Tourists rarely came that way. No signs pointed to it, but the locals knew. They protected it not with fences or guards, but with silence. It was not for spectacle. It was for remembering. When American veterans returned to Okinawa decades after the ceasefire, a few found themselves brought to the valley. They had heard fragments of the story, some exaggerated, others incomplete, but when they arrived and saw the site, they fell quiet. One of them, a former corporal who had served with Carter, broke down upon seeing the stone. He hadn't known what happened after they'd separated. No one had told him Carter had survived. No one had told him he had stayed. The village elders invited the veterans into their homes. They shared tea and photographs, some yellowed with age, others carefully preserved in cloth. There were no formal speeches, no translations needed. Instead, there were gestures, nods, eyes that met and understood. One woman, now in her 80s, pulled from a drawer a faded piece of American uniform fabric. She had kept it all those years. She said it reminded her that courage sometimes wears the face of the unexpected. Sergeant Robert Carter never spoke publicly about what happened. When asked, he would often say he didn't remember it clearly, or that he had just done what anyone else would have done. He lived a quiet life after the war, working with disabled veterans, gardening in his free time, and answering letters from strangers with brief, handwritten replies. His medals remained in a box, tucked beneath old photographs and a folded map of Okinawa. When he passed away, a small ceremony was held in his hometown. Few knew the full extent of his actions, and he had never asked for recognition. But far across the Pacific, in that quiet valley of shadows and stone, a separate ceremony took place. Uncoordinated, unofficial, but no less real. A group of villagers gathered around the marker. They brought flowers, they bowed, they lit incense, and they remembered. Because, in a war defined by destruction, what Carter had done was the opposite. He had protected. He had chosen compassion over survival, sacrifice over safety. And while governments changed, borders shifted, and memories faded, the story remained. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was true. A single man had held the line, not for glory, not for orders, but for strangers. And so, in the heart of a place once filled with fear, a quiet truth endures, that the strongest walls are not built from stone, but from choices made in moments of crisis, that even a single act, unseen by most, can ripple across generations, and that in the end, what we remember is not the war itself, but the humanity that somehow survived inside it.